This is Global Order. I'm Hindol Sengupta. I'm absolutely delighted that Professor Patrick Clawson has joined me today. He really needs no introduction on the subject that we're going to discuss today, Iran, one of the world's foremost experts on Iran with a lifetime of studying the region. Professor, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
I want to jump in right away and ask you the big question that many people want to know from you. Was it worth bombing Iran? And if yes, I was watching a video of yours from 2012 where you very, in a sense, very forcefully argued that Iran had to be stopped. Now that moment seemed to finally come in 2025. Was it worth it? And why was it worth it?
Well, certainly the hope over the years has been that we could find a diplomatic solution to this problem. But Iran has been playing us for time. They wanted to delay any kind of an agreement while they made a lot of progress on their nuclear program. We know from the huge amount of documents that the Israelis got from the Iranian archive that Iran's plan had been to produce a small arsenal of nuclear weapons rather than just producing one. And Iran is quite close to being able to do that. So the concern was that Iran might do what's called a breaking out, that is to say, move very quickly from having an advanced nuclear enrichment program and building several nuclear bombs. There were quite a number of offers to Iran on ways to resolve this problem diplomatically. Of course, Mr. Trump made an offer, but so did Britain, France, and Germany. It's often called the E3 countries. And Iran showed no interest whatsoever in its discussions with the E3 last Friday in Geneva. And Iran turned down Trump's requests to have an emergency high-level meeting. Trump offered, in fact, he himself would go to Istanbul to have this meeting, but the Iranian side evidently couldn't get approval from the Supreme Leader Khamenei for it. So the alternatives for ways to stop Iran's program didn't seem to be working. And that is the context in which these strikes have taken place.
I'd love to ask you, sir, did America finally get what it wanted? Because even as I speak to you, defined Iran is saying that they will restart their nuclear program. In your educated assessment, was the necessary damage done? Has Iran been stalled from acquiring nuclear weapons? And if yes, for what duration of time?
Stalled is a good word. And it's not really possible to stop a government from doing something like building nuclear weapons if it's determined to do it. But hopefully you can stall them for a long time. After all, Iran's had an advanced nuclear program now for more than 20 years, and that's a very long time. I would hope that 20 years from now, we're still talking about how to stall Iran's nuclear program. And after all this time and all the billions and billions of dollars that Iran has spent on its nuclear program, they haven't gotten very much for it. So at some point, hopefully the Iranian authorities ask, is this really worthwhile? I would argue that, in fact, Iran's gotten a much better return on its investment in missiles than it has on investments in nuclear weapons. And at some point, Iran may say, well, just as it wasn't worthwhile supporting Bashar al-Assad, president of Syria, we spent $30 billion on that and didn't get anything for it, so too the nuclear program is not worthwhile. And Iran would concentrate on doing other disturbing things like building missiles. But while that might be disturbing, it's not anywhere near as disturbing as having a nuclear program.
I want to also ask you the other big question, which is, do you think when President Trump threw away President Obama's Iran deal, so to speak, what is your assessment of that deal? Do you think it was a mistake to throw that deal away, or do you feel that this was the right moment and that deal wasn't serving the purpose perhaps at which it was aimed, and it had become in a sense meaningless?
Well, when the deal was first approved in 2015, my attitude towards the deal was rather similar to that of then prominent Democratic politician Hillary Clinton, and when she said that her approach to the deal was yes, and do this deal and do a whole number of other things in order to contain Iran's missile programs and its destabilizing activities. But unfortunately, the approach of the Obama administration was to say, oh, don't do anything. It might anger Iran and they would back away from the nuclear program. So they didn't do, the Obama administration didn't do much to make this deal work well. When Trump came in, I, like many people, advised him, okay, it may have been a mistake to go into the deal, but we're there now. Let's work with it as best we can and try to make it better. And there were ongoing efforts to make proposals to Iran of ways to make the deal better. But Trump is a rather impatient person, and he wanted to show that Obama had made a mistake. So Trump just walked away from the deal. I thought that was a very risky move because it'd be hard to get Iran to then agree to another deal that's more along the lines of what the United States wanted. And indeed, Iran didn't do that. So I would say that walking away from the deal turned out not just to be such a great move. The deal was not working so well. Some people focus on how the deal was limiting Iran's nuclear program. Yes, not at the expense of Iran redoubling its efforts to destabilize the region by supporting various groups that were destabilizing the governments of Iraq and Lebanon, as well as the very substantial influence that pro-Iranian elements had in Iraq and Yemen.
Let's talk a little bit about what happens next. In your assessment, what is the best case scenario? Is the best case scenario what happened once in Iraq? After Israel, with in a sense America's permission, went after Iraq's nuclear facilities. In a sense, it was stalled in such a manner that Iraq never got around to getting nuclear weapons ever. Is that a hope that you would say perhaps you have and many others have?
Well, the difficulty is that after the Israeli bombing of the Iraqi nuclear program, the Iraqi government redoubled its efforts to pursue nuclear weapons. And if Saddam Hussein hadn't made the really stupid decision to invade Kuwait in 1990, he would have had nuclear weapons within a few years. And so while the Israeli attack stalled the Iraqi program for a number of years, it didn't put an end to it. And we may face that situation with Iran as well, that these most recent attacks have stalled the program, but that Iran recommits to the program, rebuilds, and then we'll have a new crisis in a few years as Iran once again gets to be close to have nuclear weapons. So I'm not sure that we're going to have a definitive end to the Iranian program. I would hope that at some point the Iranian leadership makes the kind of decision that it did in 1988 about its war with Iraq. After years insisting war until victory, Iran accepted stopping the war cold. And there hasn't been any particular, there weren't any particular incidents then between Iran and Iraq. I would hope at some point Iran would come to a similar decision about its nuclear program, saying, oops, that was a mistake. Let's move on and do something else. Now, that's not going to end the problems we have with Iran. Iran's missile program, it continues to threaten stability in the region, and Iran might double down on its missile program.
The other question, of course, is what is your assessment of the extent of damage? Because there seems to be multiple views coming on this, Professor. On the bombing of Fordow, for instance, again, there was a lot of conversation about exactly how deep inside a mountain is it? Has it, what kind of bunker busting bombs or mops, quote unquote, have been used? Have they been successful? There are questions about what kind of radiation leaks actually happened. Is there evidence of that? What's your assessment?
The long history of military operations is that we don't know right away what happened, and that it's hard to know until you get on the ground and are able to inspect things, what happened. So even if there was a very extensive damage and destruction inside Fordow, inside Natanz, there's still going to be things left that could be salvaged. And the question will be how long it's going to take Iran to salvage it, and how hard will it be, and how many of their experts who do this do they have left. And it's not going to be apparent at first run, but it seems extremely likely that there was an enormous amount of damage done. Now, the Iranians blocked the entrances to Fordow with a lot of dirt. And they might have thought that, well, this entrance is blocked, we don't have to worry so much about what to be done attacking Fordow. Unfortunately, it's the other way around, because what the United States did was drop bombs down the ventilation shafts, which go into Fordow, and then when it exploded inside the halls of Fordow, and all that dirt blocking the exits means that the force of the blast was contained within the hall and therefore magnified and made greater. But we don't know how much damage there's been. There's certainly going to be many components left that could be salvaged and released again.
I also want to ask you a question, Professor, as a long-time global expert on Iran. There's been a lot of conversation about how stable is the Iranian regime really, and why doesn't the Iranian people, especially after Mahsa Amini's brutal death, why don't more people rise up? And we, of course, saw a lot of protests, but how secure and how strong is the regime? Now, there are different opinions about this. Some people say it's a multi-layered, deeply entrenched regime. It's very difficult for it to be removed. Others say that it's actually tottering quite a bit, and its days are numbered. I wonder where you stand in this assessment.
Well, we know from the history of autocratic regimes that they seem rock solid until they fall apart. And that fall can be very rapid, as we saw with Assad's Syria. Within not much more than 2 weeks, Assad's Syria went from proclaiming that it had won the civil war to Assad fleeing to Moscow. And similarly, when the Soviet Union fell, it happened over a period of months, but it fell very quickly. And so that's the general pattern with autocratic regimes, is they seem stable until they fall apart. Now, the Iranian regime seems to have a solid core of people, not that many, less than 20% of the population, who are determined supporters of the regime, and many of them are prepared to kill in order to stay in power. We saw that with the most recent protests, the Massa protests. The regime is quite prepared now to kill hundreds and hundreds of people protesting in order to stay in power. And that's an important impediment to people coming out to protest if they know that the other side's ready to do it. And also, the regime has been really quite successful at preventing the emergence of leaders. So as soon as somebody emerges who seems charismatic, getting a certain degree of support as a leader, the regime goes after them hard. And so without leadership and faced with the reality that the regime is prepared to kill people, These are big factors discouraging protesters and making unlikely taking place over. However, at some point, Khamenei is going to die. We can be quite confident of that. And when Khamenei dies, he's been a real micromanager, tightly controls things. With him gone, we don't know what's going to happen. But it'd be very difficult for anybody to step in and play the same kind of role. It took Khamenei more than a decade to consolidate his power and to be able to micromanage things the way he has been in the more than 20 years since he consolidated his power. And when Khamenei goes, we could have quite a different situation. It may just be chaos, or it may be that in that chaos there emerges a very different kind of government, perhaps a more hardline government, perhaps a more democratic government.
I want to ask you about something that has just come up by a couple of MIT professors, Vipin Narang, who I'm sure you know well, and somebody else, talking about what are the major threats that America faces. And one of the things that they've pointed out is Pakistan secretly building ICBMs, which can actually probably reach all the way to mainland America. Now, some people, especially in the subcontinent where I'm talking to you from, wonder if Iran's problems with Pakistan, in a sense, has taken a different shape after this conflict. Now, Pakistan started out trying to showcase that it was helping Iran, then the tonality changed. I wonder if you take these two things, Pakistan's relationship with Iran and Pakistan's building ICBMs together side by side, how do you see the scenario? Do you see new kind of axes, as it were, or axi emerging, which America needs to be worried about?
Well, for many, many years now, Pakistan and Iran have excelled at ignoring each other. You would think that these two neighboring countries with a common Baluch problem and a common problem of drug smuggling, that they would cooperate, or you might think that they would be hostile, one of them being very Shia, and the other being not only Sunni, but rather very hostile to the Shia. But I say the two governments have excelled at ignoring each other. While there's a large amount of population movement between Afghanistan and Iran, it really isn't between Pakistan or between Iran and Pakistan. So I would have to say it wouldn't be a natural thing for the two of them to cooperate on something like a missile program. After all, if Iran were interested in purchasing long-range missiles or purchasing nuclear weapons, the country that would be quite willing to sell them is North Korea. And we've seen no indications that Iran is interested in trying to get those things from North Korea. 25 years ago, Iran was getting some missile technology from North Korea, but that stopped over the years.
I also want to ask you one of the questions that a lot of people asked. There was a growing talk about the so-called Sinosphere, countries that were, in a sense, leaning towards China or in some sort of friendly relations or partnership with China. Now, we have seen in the recent past two major conflicts, of course, Pakistan, and its war with India, and of course now Iran, where the Chinese have really not stepped in, apart from supplying some weapons to the Pakistanis, which they always do. And now, this has raised the question for all the people who want a partnership with China. What sort of questions should they be asking themselves, and does that really work? What is your opinion about this Sinosphere and where it stands today?
Well, once the Israelis destroyed Iran's ability to, greatly degraded Iran's ability to produce missiles a year ago, some Israelis thought that, oh, well, now it's going to take quite a while for Iran to reconstitute its missile program. The Chinese were happy to sell things to Iran. So the Chinese are happy to take advantage of commercial opportunities, and they sold Iran a lot of what it needed to be able to rebuild its missile industry. And that, I think, illustrates a reality about modern day China, which is it's really interested in commercial opportunities, but strategic partner, not so much. So I think Pakistan has covered this as well, is that China's very happy to sell you stuff, but not necessarily there to help you in a moment of need. And if we look at what China's done across the Middle East, China has tried to be an important business partner to everybody. So much was made about the agreement that the Chinese signed with Iran. They signed a very similar agreement with Israel, and they signed a similar agreement with Saudi Arabia. So it's not that the Chinese so much pick sides, it's the Chinese look for ways to make money.
I also want to talk to you a little bit about where all of this leaves the Middle East. If the conflict, if Iran is to a degree, its regime is a lot of top leadership are dead. The war continues in Gaza. There are a lot of questions among many regimes in the Middle East and outside about acquiring nuclear weapons and whether they still could exist, as it were, completely protected by America's nuclear umbrella. All these questions are now dawning on a new sort of a new nuclear age, as it were. China, which we were just talking about, some reports suggest that it's building nuclear warheads at the rate of 100 more every single year. How do you see this entire new nuclear age that everybody's really beginning to get rather frightened of?
Well, it's certainly the case that the Chinese seem determined to acquire nuclear capabilities that are fully the equal of Russia and the United States. They don't want to have a small little nuclear program the way Britain and France have, or for that matter, Israel has. They want to be a major power. As for proliferation of nuclear programs across the Middle East, that frankly looks less likely today than it did 2 weeks ago. Because here's Iran that spent perhaps $100 billion, according to some Iranian economists, on its nuclear program. Well, what have they gotten for it? Not very much. So even if you're a rich country, Saudi Arabia, I mean, what are you going to get? If you launch a large-scale nuclear program, it'll get attacked and you won't end up with nuclear weapons. In fact, I would say that protecting against nuclear weapon and nuclear proliferation is looking better today than it did 2 weeks ago.
You're right. And of course, one major way that the Saudis had clearly very openly said that if Iran gets nuclear weapons, they will be compelled to get it too. And I guess today they would be a little more reassured that that timeline has been pushed back. But let's talk about 2 countries where some of these noises are coming from, South Korea and Japan, Professor. Always existing under the American nuclear protection, so to speak, where there are many voices coming out and saying, well, should we get resources of our own? How long can we only depend on America? What do you think America's message to these countries are at the moment?
Mixed. And so it's not surprising that we see voices in South Korea and Japan talking about the importance of nuclear weapons. I frankly am surprised we don't hear more out of Taiwan about the same subject. And all 3 of those countries had nuclear programs, which the United States had to persuade them not to have military aspects to them. So I would not be so surprising. And similarly, in Europe, it's not surprising that there is real discussion both in France and in Britain about expanding their nuclear programs and providing something of a nuclear reassurance to other countries in Europe. So, yes, I think it's fair to say that the reliance on U.S. nuclear deterrence has been brought into question in a number of important areas still going. As
we go forward, do you see the situation getting worse? Do you see a new unstable regime emerge and proliferate? Do you think more and more countries will perhaps acquire nuclear capabilities? Do you think the countries that have them at a modest level will be compelled to expand? The last part of the question I obviously have to ask, because India has questions like that, because if China expands its warheads at 100 per year, and if that's really true, there are deep existential questions for India.
Yes, there are deep existential questions for India, because yes, China is going to be expanding its nuclear program substantially. And yes, the Pakistani elite seems convinced that they have to have a very robust nuclear program to be able to prevent any attempt by Pakistan or others to decapitate the Pakistani program. So yes, I think India is in a very difficult strategic situation about nuclear weapons.
Let's talk a little bit also about any hopes, as a silver lining. What would allow us to go back to some sort of a world where proliferation can be contained, Professor? Because if this kind of proliferation happens, it's not good news for anyone. So, do you ever see the UN, of course, has become a bit of a lame duck? What would allow, in this age of, many people say it's the age of America retreating, but what would allow, in the absence of that unipolar power that America once represented, what would allow a greater containment of nuclear weapons?
Well, it's interesting that for all the talk after the setbacks that Russia experienced in Ukraine about the possibility of Russia using nuclear weapons, they were never prepared to do that. And Putin actually has not been that interested in making a huge change in Russia's nuclear stance. Xi Jinping, somebody it's harder for me to read, but he doesn't seem to be interested in arms control. Perhaps his successor will be. And if we could reach some kind of an agreement between the United States, Russia, and China about containing nuclear weapons, I do think that it would be quite possible to persuade many other countries, perhaps not North Korea, but pretty much anybody else, to restrain their nuclear programs. India doesn't seem to be that eager to have a massive arsenal of nuclear weapons. And I think that it will be possible to even reassure the Pakistanis. It'll be hard, but it will be possible. However, so long as Xi Jinping is determined that China is going to have a nuclear arsenal, and it's fully the size of the U.S. and Russian arsenals, and he's not interested in negotiating some kind of an arms control agreement under which the three big powers reduce their arms controls, we got a big problem.
How do you see the Middle East, which is a question I was, alluding to a little earlier? How do you see the Middle East evolve from here? Iran, perhaps for now, has been contained to a degree, but the war in Gaza continues. Where do you see an end game there? And where do you see an end game for, in a sense, for Israel to find peace? Because, there seems to be a constant internal urge, and many people blame Netanyahu for this, internal urge to constantly get into these wars and conflict that never seem to end. At least from inside Israel, many professors say that they believe some of this conflict, especially in Gaza, is going on to a degree because of Netanyahu's own interests and desires to continue in power. How do you see this?
Well, if we go back 2 years ago, Israel looked like it was in a very difficult situation, and its enemies seemed to be doing well everywhere. Things have changed dramatically. And whether it's the fall of Assad, whether it's Hezbollah losing most of its weapons and really dramatically less influence in Lebanon, for that matter, whether it's the militias in Iraq being much less powerful than they were. And of course, Hamas having all been so set back by the attacks from the Israelis. The question now is, will Israel understand that it's not going to dominate the Middle East and it has to pull back, or will it try to do too much? So Israel's had dramatic successes, especially in the last 6 months. But now they have to pull back a bit. And that's going to be hard to organize, in part because Israeli society is deeply divided. Bibi Netanyahu, like most politicians in India, responds to domestic political pressures more than he does to anything externally.
My last question, Professor, in your opinion, countries like India and many others in Southeast Asia worry that while all of this is happening in the Middle East, of course, also in Russia, Ukraine, and so on and so forth, America's attention has really been diverted from the Indo-Pacific, which really is beginning to look very, very shaky. Do you think America's attention in any format and in a very intense way will return to the Indo-Pacific anytime soon? Or do you think from some of these theaters, America really under Donald Trump's 2.0 government is really sort of backing off and is in retreat?
I would say that the U.S. military, U.S. government, has paid close attention to the lessons from the Ukraine war, for that matter, from Turkey's war against Turkey's support to Azerbaijan versus Armenia, the Israeli attacks on Iran. And so this has given a lot of boost to redoing the U.S. military posture. And I think that the U.S. military is today much more able to deal with the Chinese threat than it was a few years ago. And the U.S. military is racing to change the way it does things so that it would be able to respond more flexibly with more advanced weapons, advanced technology to a Chinese threat. Whereas certainly 5 years ago, the U.S. military was very self-satisfied and really not paying much attention to the advanced technologies that were being developed by China and by modern defense firms. Now they're really concentrating. I mean, nothing like the kind of defeat that Ukraine inflicted on Russia in the early days of that war to catch the attention of the U.S. military. The U.S. military does not want to be in the position that the Russian military was in.
And what about it's returning its gaze, as it were, in a fairly comprehensive way back to the Indo-Pacific? Do you see that happening anytime soon?
Oh, I think that the focus on the Indo-Pacific remains very strong, and that what we've seen is and Trump's moves about whether it's Gaza or whether it's about Iran have always been designed to try to bring things to an end quickly, so that more attention can be focused on the Indo-Pacific. And so Trump's call for a ceasefire, for instance, Trump's call for ceasefires in Gaza. All of this is designed to bring conflicts in the Middle East to an end so that the U.S. can concentrate its attention on the Indo-Pacific.
Oh, very much. That was very insightful, Professor. Thanks very much for your time. I really appreciate you joining me today to explain all of these things to our audience. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Take care.